On the day Princess Elara married a poor blacksmith, the entire royal court laughed at her choice. Rowan had no title, no wealth, and no royal family name. But as he stood beside the princess, an old royal guard suddenly saw a crescent-shaped scar beneath his collar. 22 years earlier, the kingdom's infant heir had vanished during a deadly palace attack. The same mark had been found on the missing child. The wedding hall fell silent as the guard realized the truth. The poor blacksmith standing before the princess might be the prince everyone believed had died. And somewhere inside the palace, the person who had hidden that secret for 22 years was still watching. For 22 years, the kingdom of Valadorn had carried the memory of a child who disappeared before he could even learn to speak. The child was Prince Kaelin's only son, the first heir of the elder royal branch, and the person expected to inherit the throne after his father's death. His birth had been celebrated throughout the kingdom because Kaelin had been deeply respected by the people, and many believed that his son would one day become an excellent ruler. But less than a year after the child's birth, disaster struck the royal palace. During a violent night attack, guards were killed, servants fled through secret passages, and fire spread through the eastern wing. When the royal nursery was finally reached, the child was gone. No body was ever found. The official report declared that the infant had died during the chaos, and the royal council eventually closed the investigation. Prince Kaelin had already died several months earlier from an illness, leaving King Aldrich, his younger brother, to protect the dynasty. Queen Seraphine, however, never accepted the official story. She believed the child had been taken alive. She searched for years, but every trail disappeared. Eventually, her health failed, and she died without discovering what had happened to the heir. King Aldrich continued ruling Valadorn and raised his own daughter, Princess Elara, while keeping the tragedy buried beneath the duties of the crown. Elara grew up knowing that she once had a cousin who had disappeared, but the story felt distant to her. She knew him only through an old portrait kept in her mother's private room. She never imagined that the missing child would one day return to her life as a poor blacksmith. Elara had grown tired of the royal court long before she met Rowan. Every noble family wanted her marriage to strengthen its position. Princes from neighboring kingdoms arrived with gifts and promises, while powerful dukes sent representatives to discuss alliances. King Aldrich believed that her marriage could protect Valadorn, but Elara cared more about character than political advantage. During a journey through the western provinces, she saw the difference between palace promises and real life. A violent storm had damaged several villages, destroying roofs, bridges, carts, and farming tools. Elara traveled with royal officials to inspect the damage and found herself drawn to a small blacksmith workshop at the edge of one village. The workshop belonged to Rowan. He was young, strong, and plainly dressed, with dark hair, weathered hands, and the quiet manner of someone accustomed to hard work. He had no noble name and possessed almost nothing beyond his forge, his tools, and the small home behind the workshop. Yet he spent his days repairing equipment for villagers who could barely afford food. Many received his work without paying him because he knew they had lost everything in the storm. Elara noticed this immediately. She had seen nobles make generous promises in grand halls, but Rowan helped people without expecting recognition. Their first meeting was simple. A metal fitting on one of the royal carriages had broken, and Rowan repaired it before the royal craftsman could arrive. He refused the large payment offered to him and accepted only enough to replace the metal he had used. Elara remembered that decision. She returned to the village several times under the excuse of inspecting reconstruction. Each visit brought her closer to Rowan. Their relationship developed quietly through ordinary moments. She watched him work beside his furnace, and he saw how seriously she treated villagers who were normally ignored by royal officials. Rowan had been raised by an elderly blacksmith named Thomas, who had found him as an infant near an abandoned monastery. Thomas never claimed to know the child's parents. He simply raised Rowan as his own and taught him the trade. Rowan had always accepted that explanation. He had never possessed a birth record, but he had never considered himself unfortunate. Thomas had given him a home, and the villagers had become his family. Before his death, however, Thomas had warned Rowan that there were things about his childhood he could not explain. He had told Rowan that some truths were dangerous when revealed too early. Rowan had thought those words were only the worries of an old man. Elara eventually realized that her feelings for Rowan had become stronger than friendship. Rowan felt the same, although he was afraid that his lack of status would eventually destroy her future. When King Aldrich discovered their relationship, he immediately rejected the idea of marriage. The royal council agreed with him. To them, Rowan was simply a poor craftsman with no family name, no estate, and no political value. They considered Elara's choice an insult to the crown. Elara refused to change her mind. Her father warned that marrying Rowan could cost her position in the succession, but she accepted the risk. Eventually, Aldrich allowed the wedding to proceed, although he remained deeply unhappy. The court prepared for what many nobles considered the most embarrassing royal wedding in generations. Rowan entered the capital wearing simple formal clothing rather than the expensive garments prepared for him. He had no interest in pretending to be someone else. He wanted to marry Elara as the man she had chosen, not as a person created for the royal court. Yet, on the day before the wedding, something happened that neither of them expected. Sir Garan, an elderly royal guard who had served Queen Seraphine 22 years earlier, saw Rowan carrying a ceremonial box through a palace corridor. Rowan's collar shifted, revealing a pale crescent-shaped mark beneath his collarbone. Garan stopped immediately. He remembered seeing the same mark on the missing infant. He remembered Queen Seraphine ordering him to memorize every identifying feature of the child because she feared something might happen. Garan did not tell the king immediately. He began searching the old records instead. What he discovered made his suspicions stronger. Rowan's childhood had no official record. Thomas had once worked for the royal household, and the abandoned monastery where Rowan had supposedly been found stood near the secret route used during the night of the prince's disappearance. Garan realized that the poor blacksmith standing in the palace might not be an outsider at all. He might be the missing heir, but someone else noticed Garan's investigation. Lord Varick, the king's most powerful advisor, had spent 22 years protecting a secret buried beneath the official history of Valadorn. He knew that the prince had not died. He also knew that the child had been rescued. For years, Varick had believed the boy would never return. Now, with the wedding only hours away, the past had suddenly appeared in the form of a young blacksmith. If Rowan's identity became known, The power Varric had built for 2 decades could collapse overnight. Varric had not become the most influential advisor in Valadorn by accident. He understood fear, ambition, and silence. 22 years earlier, several powerful nobles had feared that Prince Kaelin's son would eventually become king and reduce their control over the kingdom. Varric had joined their secret alliance, believing that removing the infant heir would create a weaker succession and allow the council to control the throne. The palace attack had been designed to look like an enemy assault, but the attackers had entered through a secret passage opened by someone inside the palace. The infant was taken from the nursery, and the official story of his death was created before the flames had even stopped. Varric had expected the child to disappear forever. He had never imagined that a royal craftsman named Thomas would find the infant and escape with him. When Garan began investigating Rowan, Varric immediately understood the danger. He sent men to the western village where Rowan had lived since childhood. Their task was to search the old forge and destroy anything connecting Rowan to the royal family. They arrived after midnight while Rowan was away helping a farmer repair storm damage. The workshop appeared ordinary, but one of Varric's men noticed that a stone beneath the forge sounded hollow. They moved it and discovered a hidden wooden compartment. Inside was an old box belonging to Thomas. The box contained several objects that should never have survived the palace attack. There was a small silver emblem bearing the symbol of the elder royal branch. There was a piece of faded blue cloth embroidered with a golden sun, and there was a sealed letter carrying Queen Seraphine's private mark. The men took the box and returned to the capital, believing they had removed the evidence. They did not know that Thomas had once shown Rowan the box. Rowan remembered the blue cloth and the silver emblem, although he had never understood what they meant. He also remembered Thomas's warning that his past could become dangerous if the wrong people discovered it. When Elara learned that strangers had broken into Rowan's workshop, she traveled to the village with Garan. The workshop had been searched, but one important hiding place remained untouched. Beneath a loose floorboard, they discovered an old leather folder containing a map and several damaged notes. One note described a secret route leading from the palace to the western forest. Another mentioned a royal craftsman carrying an infant away from the capital. A third described the abandoned monastery where Rowan had supposedly been found. The pieces began fitting together. Garan believed Thomas had rescued the missing heir. Elara wanted to believe him, but she knew that proving Rowan's identity could change everything. If Rowan was truly the lost heir, he would no longer be simply the poor man she had chosen. He would become a political figure whose existence could threaten powerful people. Before Garan could finish the investigation, Varric approached King Aldrich with an accusation. He claimed Rowan had deliberately entered Elara's life as part of a conspiracy. According to Varric, Thomas had trained Rowan to behave like a royal heir and had planted the crescent-shaped mark as false evidence. The king was troubled. He already feared that Elara had sacrificed her future for a man he considered unsuitable. Now he was being told that Rowan might be part of a larger plot. Rowan was taken into royal custody while the investigation continued. He did not resist. He understood that anger would make him appear guilty. Elara was confined to the palace, but she refused to accept Varric's accusations. She searched her mother's private rooms and found several letters that had never been placed in the official archives. Queen Seraphine had written that she suspected someone inside the palace was involved in the prince's disappearance. One letter mentioned a private family symbol used only by the elder branch of the dynasty. Another described a silver bracelet placed on the infant before the attack. Elara found the bracelet hidden inside an old wooden case. The symbol matched the emblem discovered in Thomas's workshop. Garan also found an old map showing the secret passage that had been sealed after the attack. When he followed the route toward the western forest, he discovered that someone had recently destroyed the old monastery. The evidence was being erased one piece at a time. Then, before dawn, an elderly woman appeared at the palace gates. Her name was Mara. She had once served inside the royal nursery and had disappeared immediately after the prince vanished. Garan recognized her from an old portrait. Mara carried a faded blue bundle and refused to leave until she was taken before the king. Inside the bundle was a small silver bracelet made for the missing heir. Mara's return gave Garan the first living witness who could explain what happened during the attack. She had not returned for money or status. She had returned because she had learned that Rowan was about to marry Princess Elara, and she believed the wedding would become the final chance to reveal the truth. Mara explained that on the night of the attack, the nursery door had already been unlocked before the attackers arrived. She had realized that someone inside the palace had helped them. She took the infant through a secret passage, hoping to reach a safe location. When part of the passage collapsed, she met Thomas near the western forest. Thomas recognized the royal blanket and understood that the child was the missing heir. He took the infant and disappeared before Varric's men could reach them. Mara had escaped in another direction and spent 22 years living under another name. She had never forgotten the child. Now, after seeing Rowan's description, she knew the time had come to return. The bracelet she carried bore a private symbol that could not have been forged by an ordinary craftsman. Garan compared it with the emblem from Thomas's box and found that both belonged to the elder royal branch. The mystery was no longer a rumor. The poor blacksmith had a connection to the royal family. Yet one question remained, whether he was truly the missing heir or merely someone who had inherited objects connected to him. The answer would be discovered inside the palace, where an old royal record had been hidden for more than 2 decades. Mara was brought before King Aldrich, Garan, and several trusted historians. Her testimony was carefully recorded because everyone understood that a single false claim could create a political crisis. Mara described the night of the attack in precise detail. She had been inside the nursery when the alarm sounded. The guards rushed toward the eastern corridor, believing that enemies had entered from outside. Yet the nursery had already been opened from within. Mara realized that the attack had been planned by someone with access to the palace. She took the infant and escaped through a hidden passage known only to a few senior servants. She carried the child wrapped in the blue royal blanket and wore the small silver bracelet around his wrist. Near the western forest, she encountered Thomas. He recognized the royal markings and immediately understood that the child was the missing heir. He promised to protect him. Mara then separated from Thomas because Varric's men were searching the forest. She survived by hiding in distant villages and changing her name. For years she waited for proof that the child was alive. When she finally saw Rowan's description, she recognized the crescent-shaped mark. King Aldrich listened without interruption. The possibility that his family's lost heir had survived shook him deeply. He had spent 22 years believing that his brother's only son was dead. Now the evidence suggested that the child had been protected by an ordinary blacksmith. Rowan was brought into the chamber. Mara looked at him for a long moment and recognized the features of the infant she had carried away from the burning palace. Rowan did not remember her, but the sight of the old blue cloth triggered a faint childhood memory. He remembered Thomas keeping a similar piece of fabric inside a locked box. The connection between his childhood and the royal family became stronger. Elara entered the chamber carrying the bracelet found in her mother's private room. Garan compared the bracelet with the mark on Rowan's neck and with the old medical description of the missing heir. Everything matched. But another discovery created confusion. The old medical record described the child as the son of Prince Kaelin, not the son of King Aldric. This was important because Kaelin had been Aldric's elder brother. Rowan was therefore not Elara's brother. He was the surviving heir of the elder royal branch and her cousin. His claim to the throne came through his father's line. The discovery removed the greatest obstacle between Rowan and Elara, but it also made the political consequences much greater. Rowan was not merely a lost member of the royal family. He was the person who had the strongest hereditary claim to the throne. Varric immediately tried to destroy the evidence. He produced documents claiming that Thomas had invented Rowan's identity. He presented witnesses who claimed that the blacksmith had been prepared for years to enter the royal family. Yet Garan recognized several signatures on those documents as belonging to officials who had served under Varric. The evidence against the advisor began to grow. One witness admitted that Varric had ordered old succession records to be changed after Prince Kaelin's death. Another revealed that the official report of the palace attack had been written before the investigation was complete. A third remembered seeing Varric near the secret passage on the night the child disappeared. Varric's carefully constructed story began collapsing. Still, King Aldric refused to declare Rowan heir without final proof. Garan searched the old royal nursery and discovered a carved symbol hidden beneath a damaged stone panel. Queen Seraphine had placed the symbol there herself. It matched the private emblem found among Thomas's belongings. A royal historian then discovered an older document explaining that the symbol had been used to identify members of Prince Kaelin's household. The evidence was now complete. Rowan was the missing child. He was the surviving son of Prince Kaelin and the rightful heir of the elder royal branch. King Aldric publicly recognized him. Bells rang throughout the capital, and the news spread from the palace to the western villages where Rowan had grown up. Yet Rowan did not celebrate immediately. He had spent his entire life believing he was a blacksmith. The crown now offered him a position he had never requested. He remembered Thomas, the old forge, the villagers who had supported him, and the simple life he had built. He feared that accepting the throne would force him to abandon everything that had shaped him. Elara understood. She did not pressure him to become someone else. She had chosen Rowan before learning about his bloodline, and she wanted him to remain the same person. King Aldric also understood that Rowan could not simply step into the palace and forget his past. He offered him time to learn the responsibilities of the crown. Rowan accepted. His first request was not for wealth or luxury. He asked for the return of Thomas's belongings and permission to preserve the old forge. Aldric agreed. Then Rowan made another request. He wanted to continue working with craftsmen and farmers because he believed that a future king should understand the people he would rule. The royal council reluctantly accepted the arrangement. Meanwhile, Varric was arrested. His network was exposed, and the names of the nobles involved in the conspiracy were revealed. The 22-year-old secret had finally been broken. Yet Rowan's story was not ending with the discovery of his identity. It was only beginning. He still had to decide whether he would accept the crown, whether he would remain with Elara, and whether a man raised beside a furnace could truly learn to rule a kingdom that had once believed he was dead. Rowan spent the following months between the palace and the village where he had grown up. He attended lessons with royal historians, studied the laws of succession, observed council meetings, and learned how the kingdom was governed. At the same time, he continued visiting the forge and speaking with ordinary workers. The contrast between the two worlds helped him understand why the royal court had failed to notice so many problems. Inside the palace, reports described villages in numbers. Outside the palace, Rowan met the people behind those numbers. He saw farmers struggling with damaged roadies, craftsmen unable to obtain good materials, and families waiting months for officials to resolve simple disputes. His experience as a blacksmith gave him a different perspective on government. He understood that a small problem left unsolved could eventually become a serious one. Elara worked beside him as she continued her own responsibilities. She had once wanted to escape the political expectations surrounding her, but she now saw an opportunity to change the palace from within. She helped Rowan understand court traditions while he helped her understand the needs of rural communities. Their relationship became stronger because they were no longer simply two people trying to protect their private life from the royal court. They were becoming partners with a shared responsibility. King Aldrich watched them carefully. He had initially opposed their marriage because Rowan had appeared to be an unsuitable commoner. Now he realized that the qualities he had considered weaknesses were actually the reasons Rowan could become a strong ruler. Rowan did not care about expensive clothing. He did not seek attention. He listened before making decisions. He understood the value of labor. Most importantly, he had no hunger for power. The royal council eventually began to respect him. Some nobles still resisted, but their arguments became weaker as Rowan demonstrated his abilities. He proposed repairing rural roads before building another royal monument. He supported local workshops and created training programs for young craftsmen. He also requested that royal officials spend time in villages before preparing economic reports. These decisions initially seemed unusual, but they produced visible results. Trade improved, damaged bridges were repaired, and villagers began trusting the crown again. Rowan never claimed that his blacksmith background made him better than the nobles. Instead, he believed that it gave him a perspective the palace needed. The investigation into Varric's conspiracy continued during this period. Old documents revealed that Varric had manipulated the royal council for years. He had changed records, pressured witnesses, and removed people who knew too much. Several nobles admitted their involvement. Their testimony showed that the prince's disappearance had been planned because powerful families feared the elder royal branch. Varric had believed that controlling the succession would allow him to control the kingdom. His greatest mistake had been assuming that the child would never return. During his trial, the full truth became public. The palace attack had been an inside operation. The infant Heir had been taken alive. Thomas had rescued him. Queen Seraphine had suspected the truth but had died before she could expose it. Mara had survived as the last living witness. The kingdom finally understood why the investigation had failed. It had been controlled by the people who had created the crime. Varric was sentenced according to the laws of Valadorn, and the nobles who had participated in the conspiracy lost their positions. Rowan refused to interfere with the judgment. He wanted justice to be based on evidence rather than revenge. After the trial, he returned to the village and stood inside Thomas's old workshop. The forge was quiet, but the place still carried the memories of his childhood. He touched the tools that Thomas had left behind and remembered the old man's warning that blood could explain where a person came from, but could never determine what kind of person he would become. Rowan finally understood that he did not need to choose between being a blacksmith and being an heir. He could carry both identities with him. He could become a ruler without abandoning the values he had learned from ordinary life. When he returned to the palace, Rowan accepted the position of crown prince. The decision was announced throughout Valadorn. The court prepared an elaborate ceremony, but Rowan requested something simpler. He wanted the villagers who had known him before the revelation to be invited. He wanted Thomas's old hammer displayed beside the royal emblem during the ceremony. The king agreed. Elara stood beside Rowan as the court formally recognized him as the heir. The moment carried a strange symmetry. The same palace that had once looked down on him because he was poor now honored him because it had discovered his bloodline. Yet Rowan understood that his worth had existed before the ceremony. Elara understood it too. Their wedding preparations resumed, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The nobles who had mocked Rowan were now eager to gain his favor. Rowan ignored their sudden interest. He remembered how quickly people could change when a title appeared. He trusted the villagers and the craftsmen who had respected him before they knew he was royal. Elara also refused to forget what had happened. She believed the court needed to learn that dignity did not come from wealth. Their wedding would therefore be more than a royal celebration. It would represent the return of the lost heir and the beginning of a different kind of royal family. Before the ceremony, Rowan visited Thomas's memorial. He placed the old hammer beside it and stood quietly for a long time. The man who had raised him was not there to see the truth revealed, but Rowan believed Thomas would have been proud. The royal heir had finally returned to his kingdom. But he had not returned alone. He carried the values of the forge with him. He carried the memory of a humble man who had protected a child without asking for anything in return. And as Rowan walked back toward the palace, he knew that his greatest challenge had not been discovering who he was. It was proving that the man he had become was worthy of the people who had waited 22 years for their lost heir to return. Spring transformed Valadorn into a kingdom of celebration. Royal banners covered the capital, flowers decorated the palace roads, and people traveled from distant provinces to witness the wedding of Princess Elara and the newly recognized heir. Only months earlier, the same marriage had been considered an embarrassment. The court had laughed because Rowan was a poor blacksmith with no title. Now those same nobles stood in the palace preparing to honor him. Rowan noticed the change, but did not allow it to affect him. He remembered that Elara had chosen him before anyone knew his identity. That memory remained more important than the royal ceremonies surrounding their wedding. The palace tailors prepared magnificent clothing for Rowan, but he chose a simpler ceremonial outfit with dark fabric and modest royal embroidery. He also kept the small metal ring Tomas had given him as a child. Elara selected a gown that was elegant but less extravagant than the one originally planned for a political marriage. She wanted the ceremony to represent their actual story rather than the expectations of the court. On the morning of the wedding, Rowan returned to the western village one final time. The villagers gathered outside the forge, remembering the young man who had spent years repairing their tools. Many still found it difficult to believe that the blacksmith they knew was actually the lost heir of Valadorn. Rowan entered the workshop and looked around. The furnace, tools, wooden table, and old walls had changed very little. He realized that this place would always be part of him. He had been born into a royal family, but he had become himself inside this small workshop. Before leaving, he placed one hand on the old anvil and silently thanked Thomas for everything he had done. He then returned to the capital. The wedding hall was filled with nobles, soldiers, villagers, merchants, and representatives from neighboring kingdoms. King Aldrich stood beside the royal throne. His expression was no longer that of a father worried about an unsuitable marriage. He now looked at Rowan with pride. Although Rowan was not his son, he was the surviving heir of the elder branch, and Aldrich had come to see him as family. Elara entered the hall and walked toward Rowan. The court fell silent. Their journey had begun in a small village, where a princess had met a poor blacksmith repairing a damaged carriage. It had continued through suspicion, imprisonment, hidden records, and a 22-year conspiracy. Now they stood together before the kingdom. The ceremony proceeded without interruption. Rowan and Elara were married under the royal banners, and the bells of Valadorn rang across the capital. After the ceremony, King Aldrich formally announced Rowan as the crown prince and rightful heir of the kingdom. The crowd responded with enormous celebration. Rowan accepted the title, but his first public act surprised the court. He announced that the royal treasury would fund workshops in rural provinces so that young people without noble connections could learn useful trades. He wanted the kingdom to recognize talent wherever it appeared. Elara announced her own plan to expand schools in the western provinces. Their goals were different but connected. Rowan wanted people to have opportunities through work, while Elara wanted them to have opportunities through education. Together they began reshaping the relationship between the palace and ordinary citizens. Their marriage also became a symbol of the changes taking place in Valadorn. Elara had chosen Rowan when he had nothing. Rowan had accepted Elara before knowing that he was destined for the throne. Their relationship had never depended on wealth. That was why the people trusted them. In the years that followed, Rowan and Elara often traveled outside the capital. They visited farms, workshops, schools, and markets without bringing enormous royal entourages. Rowan inspected bridges and agricultural equipment, while Elara spoke with teachers and families. Their visits gave them information that official reports could never provide. They discovered problems quickly and solved many of them before they became serious. The kingdom gradually became more prosperous. Farmers gained better roads, craftsmen gained access to materials, and young people from poor families gained opportunities that had once belonged only to nobles. Some members of the old aristocracy resisted, but Rowan refused to fight them through anger. He believed that good results would eventually speak louder than old traditions. King Aldrich eventually reduced his own political duties and allowed Rowan to lead more of the kingdom. The transition was peaceful because Rowan had earned the trust of the people. He had not demanded authority. He had demonstrated responsibility. One evening, Aldrich visited Rowan in the royal workshop. The old king watched as Rowan repaired a damaged metal hinge brought by a palace servant. The sight made him smile because he understood how strange the journey had been. The kingdom had searched for its lost heir in distant lands, royal archives, and secret passages, while the child had been growing up beside a simple forge. Aldrich realized that the years outside the palace had not weakened Rowan's claim. They had prepared him for it. Rowan eventually became the king's closest advisor and effectively governed many areas of the kingdom before receiving the crown. Elara remained beside him throughout the transition. Their marriage became stronger because they continued to treat each other as partners rather than symbols of royalty. Neither forgot the day the court had laughed at Rowan. They did not seek revenge against those nobles. Instead, they allowed time and good leadership to prove how wrong the court had been. The wedding that had once seemed like a foolish choice became remembered as one of the most important moments in Valadorn's history. A princess had trusted her heart when everyone else trusted status. A blacksmith had remained humble when everyone else suddenly wanted his attention, and a kingdom had discovered that its lost heir had been living among ordinary people all along. As Rowan prepared to inherit the throne, he made one final visit to Thomas's memorial. He placed a royal medal beside the old hammer, but he did not remove the hammer. He wanted future generations to see both objects together. One represented the bloodline he had inherited. The other represented the life that had shaped him. He understood that he needed both. Years later, King Aldrich finally stepped away from the throne. The kingdom had enjoyed a long period of stability, and Rowan was ready to become king. The coronation took place in the same great hall where the royal court had once mocked the idea of a princess marrying a blacksmith. This time, the hall was filled with people who knew the entire story. Nobles stood beside craftsmen, farmers stood beside soldiers, teachers stood beside merchants. Rowan walked toward the throne, wearing the ceremonial clothing of the royal family. But beneath his coat, he still carried the small metal ring Thomas had given him. He accepted the crown without forgetting the person he had been before it. His first years as king were focused on practical changes rather than grand displays of wealth. He expanded the rural workshops, strengthened schools, improved roads, and created new opportunities for young people from poor families. He believed that the kingdom could become stronger if ordinary people were given the chance to develop their abilities. Elara became queen beside him and continued her educational reforms. Together they created a royal council that included not only nobles but also experienced craftsmen, farmers, teachers, merchants, and scholars. This change was controversial at first, but it gave the king a broader understanding of the kingdom. Rowan had learned from his own life that wisdom did not belong to one social class. Some of the old nobles disliked the changes, but the kingdom's prosperity gradually silenced most opposition. Trade increased, villages developed, and more families could build stable lives. Rowan never forgot that his own life had begun far from the palace. Every year, he and Elara returned to the western village. The people there still treated him differently from the nobles in the capital. They remembered the boy who had carried coal, repaired plows, and worked until sunset. During these visits, Rowan always entered the old forge. It had been preserved exactly as he requested. The furnace was still there. The tools remained on the walls, and Thomas's old workbench stood near the window. Rowan sometimes picked up the hammer and repaired a simple piece of metal. He did not do it because a king needed to prove that he could still work with his hands. He did it because the forge reminded him of who he was. Elara understood this. She often waited nearby while Rowan worked. Their relationship had changed with age, but the foundation remained the same. They had chosen each other before the crown became part of their lives. They had survived the discovery of Rowan's identity, the political conspiracy, and the pressure of the royal court. Their marriage had never been built on his inheritance. It had been built on trust. The story of Lord Varric eventually became part of the kingdom's history. His conspiracy was taught in royal schools as a warning about the danger of unchecked power. The lesson was not simply that Varric had been evil. It was that a government becomes vulnerable when too few people control its information. Rowan therefore made sure that royal records could no longer be changed secretly by one advisor or one faction. Important decisions required independent witnesses and written records accessible to several offices. He believed that the best protection against another Varric was not fear, but transparency. Mara lived long enough to see Rowan crowned king. She was honored publicly for protecting the infant heir 22 years earlier. Rowan visited her personally and thanked her for saving his life. He also ensured that Thomas's name was remembered throughout Valadorn. A memorial was built beside the old forge, but Rowan deliberately kept it simple. It showed Thomas holding a blacksmith's hammer rather than standing beside a crown. The message was clear. Thomas had not protected Rowan because he wanted to create a king. He had protected a helpless child because it was the right thing to do. Rowan considered that act one of the greatest examples of courage in the kingdom's history. His children later grew up hearing the story of their father's childhood. They knew that he had been born a prince, lost for 22 years, and eventually returned to the palace. But Rowan always emphasized another part of the story. He told them that royal blood had not taught him patience. The forge had. Royal tutors had not taught him compassion. The villagers had. The crown had not taught him responsibility. Thomas had. He wanted his children to understand that inheritance could give someone a position, but only choices could give that position meaning. As the years passed, Rowan's reign became associated with stability and fairness. He was not remembered as the king who had secretly been a prince. He was remembered as the ruler who understood ordinary life. That distinction mattered to him. He never wanted the mystery of his birth to become more important than the work of his reign. Elara remained his closest advisor and partner. Together they continued visiting communities throughout Valadorn. Their children sometimes accompanied them, learning directly from farmers, craftsmen, and teachers. The royal family became more connected to the kingdom than it had been for generations. The old divide between palace and village slowly weakened. One evening, many years after the original wedding, Rowan and Elara stood outside the forge as the sun disappeared behind the western hills. The village was quiet. The same road where the royal carriage had once stopped was now lined with houses and workshops. Children played near the school Elara had helped establish. Young craftsmen worked inside new buildings, funded through Rowan's royal program. Rowan looked toward the forge and remembered the day he had first met Elara. At that time, she had been a princess visiting a damaged village, and he had been a blacksmith repairing a broken carriage fitting. Neither had known that the meeting would change the history of Valadorn. They had not known about the missing heir, the secret passage, the royal bracelet, or the conspiracy. They had simply seen something good in each other. That was why Rowan believed the most important part of their story happened before anyone discovered his identity. Elara had loved him when he had no crown. The villagers had respected him when he had no title. Thomas had protected him when there was no reward. The kingdom eventually learned that Rowan was the rightful heir, but the discovery only revealed what those people had already understood. He was valuable before he became royal. His bloodline explained his place in history, but his character explained why he deserved a place in the future. Rowan and Elara remained together for the rest of their lives. Their kingdom prospered, their family grew, and the memory of the 22-year mystery slowly became a story told to new generations. Children often asked how the lost heir had been discovered. The answer always began with an old royal guard noticing a crescent-shaped mark beneath the collar of a poor blacksmith on his wedding day. But the story never ended there. It continued with a queen who had refused to judge a man by his wealth, a craftsman who protected a child without asking for reward, a guard who refused to ignore a forgotten clue, and a kingdom that finally faced the truth it had buried for 2 decades. The wedding that began with laughter from the royal court ended by changing the kingdom itself. Princess Elara had not thrown away her future by marrying a poor blacksmith. She had unknowingly chosen the man who would one day wear the crown. Yet even after the crown was placed upon his head, Rowan never stopped thinking like the young craftsman who had once stood beside a village furnace. He knew that power could disappear, titles could change, and royal records could be rewritten. What remained was the way a person treated others when nobody was watching. That was the lesson Thomas had given him, and it became the principle of his reign. In the end, the lost heir returned to the kingdom. The princess became his queen. The conspiracy that had divided the royal family was exposed, and Valadorn entered a new era of peace. Rowan gained the throne he had never expected, but he never allowed the throne to become the most important part of his identity. He remained the blacksmith who had learned to care for broken things, and he carried that lesson into every decision he made as king. The forge had shaped his hands, the village had shaped his heart, and the crown finally gave him the opportunity to use both for the good of the kingdom